Hey, everybody, and welcome to DocTalk. I'm Dr. Erin Knopf.
I'm Dr. Corinne Hannan, and we are so excited today to have our guest speaker. We have Kira Denney here with us to talk to us about human trafficking and eating disorders. Kira, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself to our audience?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this talk, which I know we kind of talked about is very much overlooked and sometimes just not even investigated or shared with providers. So really looking forward to it. I'm originally from Florida, kind of just have been making my way up the East Coast. Currently living in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor and supervisor in multiple states, but mainly up all of the East Coast. I own a private practice with the registered dietitian for virtual care, and I'm also the clinical director for Montanito Walden's inpatient eating disorder.
Well, you're busy, you're experienced, you're credentialed. We're so excited to learn from you. So, why don't we just start out with a really basic question because you said it's very often overlooked, not talked about, not thought about. What is human trafficking?
So a lot of times when someone thinks of human trafficking, they do think of the movie Taken by Liam Neeson. And there's very, very, very little truth to trafficking in that film. It's a great film, but really the U.S. law defines human trafficking as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person into commercial sex acts or labor or services against his or her will. The only exception to that is when it does involve a minor in commercial sex. Inducing a minor into any commercial sex is considered human trafficking, regardless of if there's any presence of force, fraud, or coercion.
So, what do you feel like are some of the myths, other than like Taken and Liam Neeson being part of a human trafficking story? What are some common myths associated with survivors of human trafficking?
I would say one of the most pervasive myths about human trafficking is that it's always or often involves kidnapping or otherwise physically forcing someone into a situation, where in reality, most human traffickers use psychological means such as tricking, defrauding, manipulating, or threatening victims into providing commercial sex or exploited labor. Another myth is that it requires like transportation of any kind. There's a lot of conversations where it's only people in other countries, and that's not the case. It happens in our backyard. Unfortunately, it happens everywhere. There are maybe areas where it shows up a little bit more, which could be transient areas such as places that have a higher train or bus, station, such as like Union Station in DC. We think about the station in Philly, Boston, and then actually there's a really predominant exposure to it out in Arizona and Las Vegas. So that's kind of some key areas, but that doesn't mean that it's just within the US. It's everywhere. That's kind of the biggest thing is people are like, oh, they must be like coming into the US from other countries. And that's not the case. I would say another one is that victims are targeted by people that they don't know. And a majority of it is actually traffickers that have either know someone who knows someone to kind of groom them into that situation, or it's their own family members, their own siblings, their own parents, their own grandparents, their own uncles, aunts. It can be literally anyone. And I think that's another big piece of it is that people like, oh, that could never happen to me. And the truth of the matter is that it very well could happen depending on, what the situation is.
I'm imagining like financial desperation can be a trigger for someone to, try to put their loved one in this. I mean, are there other kind of impetus that are commonly seen of why it ends up being like from a friend or family member?
It can be that maybe a family member kind of themselves maybe did or was trafficked by someone that they didn't know. And then now they're part of that system. And so now they're room to recruit and like to be able to maintain whatever status it is in that, to be able to have housing. So there's a lot of potential benefits that someone is gaining from that's being trafficked, whether that's housing, food, income, just a safe place, which it's usually not a safe place, but when there's certain things outside of the external factors that they can't control, that might be the only consistency and safe place for them that they feel in that moment.
Is it a myth that people get talked into this through like contacts on social media, or does that occasionally happen?
That can definitely happen. When we think about the different types of actually trafficking, the National Human Trafficking Hotline and also Polaris is a national organization in DC, and they've actually identified 5 different types. They have a thing called the typology of classification, and an incredible resource if you're ever on their website. But there's 25 types of human trafficking, 5 which were actually only identified as sex trafficking. The other 15 are labor, and then 5 of them have kind of labor and commercial sex combined. So there's a bunch of different areas where people can be trafficked, and some of those are arts and entertainment, illicit massages, hotels and hospitality, escort service, outdoor solicitation, personal sexual servitude. Again, they think about maybe what they've seen in media or movies or in print, and the actuality is that most trafficking is happening in ways that we don't even think about.
Makes a lot of sense. Like the exploitation never ends, right? It's not just physical acts. That's really helpful to point that out.
Yeah.
I'm just dumbfounded. I mean, I had always heard like the Super Bowl, for example, is one of the biggest events for trafficking. And when you put the types of trafficking out there the way you just did, that makes so much sense. Oh my gosh. If you've been to Vegas, I don't know, I feel like escorts are everywhere. And I never really connected with the way that individual got there. I actually thought it was more from a consenting perspective, no coercion, no manipulation. But oh my gosh.
Yeah. And there's actually, which came out in the International Justice Mission, which covers a bunch of different things. One being human trafficking, is that there actually hasn't been definitive data that actually points to a significant increase in trafficking around the Super Bowl. And at some point there is something that was said or something that came out that then everyone actually tied it to that. Yeah. So that's actually another kind of myth. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Any other myths that we haven't covered that come to mind?
There's so many, but I would say another kind of big one is that it's always a violent crime, right? Like when we think about, like someone's kidnapped, they don't even know it's happening. Again, it can happen so psychologically, manipulation, that they don't even realize what's happening until they're in that situation or they're wanting to get out. And then like, wait, I'm having all of this control taken from me. I think that's another piece, is that it doesn't have to be violent. It can be someone, it can be a partner that, you did have a beautiful relationship in the beginning, and then slowly that turned into something more as you got deeper into that relationship. And next thing you know, you're in a trafficking situation.
So we obviously need more education, more awareness, more prevention, and more resources and more research, as usual. But Kira, what got you kicked off in working in this field?
Like I said, I'm originally from Florida, and during grad school, I worked with eating disorders, but then had a supervisor who did a lot of anti-human trafficking work out in Florida. As she and I were talking, I was just kind of very interested in that work and was still very interested in eating disorders. So when I moved to DC, I continued to work for a eating disorder treatment center out in Virginia, and actually moved up there to work for the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I was a hotline advocate. I don't know if you've ever been to the airport and you see, call if you see something, right? You see that number. And so we would get calls from people that are just suspicious of something. We always went with, if you see something, say something, even if you don't have any data, that we'd rather have a little bit of something. And through that, sometimes we would get victims or traffickers or trafficking survivors calling us for resources. That led to me just kind of getting connected with more resources in the DMV area, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And I wanted to do more hands-on work. I love being a hotline advocate, but with that, you're getting just such a small piece of it. You're getting that person that's in crisis. And that can be really hard when you're on that call and you don't know what you're coming across when you answer that. So I ended up working for a safe house out in DC while I was still working at an eating disorder center. I started to see a lot of similarities of control in this means, and feeling unsafe and feeling like they had to continue to always be on the lookout for the traffic. At that time, I was very young in my career. The more I talked to some of these survivors and victims and in the community of trafficking, individuals that are coming out of a situation, it's really their decision to name if they want to identify as a victim or survivor. I kind of just use them interchangeably in this sense. But as I'm working with survivors and we're talking, and they're getting kind of established, if we think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they're getting their basic kind of needs of housing because they're in a safe house. They're kind of starting to reincorporate. They're getting their documents back. That's one thing that traffickers will do, is they'll withhold documentation. That could be a passport, that could be a license, so that they can't go anywhere. And that's why bus and train stations are a very heavy populated area, because you do not have to have identification to get on buses and trains in the same way you do if you had to get on a plane or a cruise or something like that. The one thing I was noticing was this complicated relationship with food and complicated relationship with body. And I was like, oh, this is very interesting. And so as I was working at that safe house, really focused on that with many of them, while also doing some of the case management, just getting reintegrated back into life. When I left DC, I always stayed connected with different organizations that I either worked for or just knew working from the hotline. And once someone is established with those basic necessities and needs, I will see them for long-term therapy. One, just trauma in general, but if there's that eating disorder, we can tie that back into it and reintegrate a healthy relationship with body and food.
Wow.
Wow, I'm so glad that you walk the earth. Like, what an
Seriously.
incredible person to be working with so much trauma and so much need. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Out of a myth question I wanted to ask you. I heard that this is like a symbol for getting help, like I'm trapped, or is that a myth?
I can't say yes or no to that, like definitively or not. I think there is some truth to that depending on someone's situation. I wouldn't say it's necessarily for trafficking specifically, but for people that are maybe in danger or in unsafe situations, whether that's a domestic violence situation or potentially trafficking, but there's nothing that indicates that like that is for individuals that are being trafficked.
Good to know. So now you've told us why or how you got into the work. Do you want to tell us also why you do this work? Why this matters?
Yeah. I find it honestly really interesting and very fascinating. I love to do research. Unfortunately, very little research between human trafficking and the intersection of eating disorders. There's a lot about trauma, and we think about how trauma and eating disorders manifest. And so you can kind of pull a little bit of ties. I've connected with a couple of other providers that are eating disorder providers that have worked in that field. And we can see the connection, but there's just not enough out there. I don't know what it looks like to eventually do broader research on that, but I just think that it's so important, especially working currently now at an inpatient unit where we are getting more so people that might be coming in with that type of situation. And again, that's not to say that people that are in outpatient care, you might not come across those individuals, but in a hospital, it's a little bit different. It's a different clientele and that necessity and that need to how far they might be needing the severity of their eating disorder at that point. It's often overlooked. I mean, I think about in grad school, I was not taught about human trafficking other than the fact that one of my professors and supervisors worked in that field, but I don't think I would have been taught about it or had much awareness around it. And I think about even in my professional development, there aren't many conversations around it. There very much are within the anti-trafficking field and awareness field. But again, it's not usually tied to the mental health aspect or the eating disorder aspect. It's more so like, hey, this is going on.
If anything, we know how eating disorders are a maladaptive coping strategy. And I could imagine too, in human trafficking, there's at times a mandate to look a certain way. So I'm curious too, is this chicken egg kind of situation? We know that also intentional weight loss can be the biggest risk factor for an eating disorder. From the data you've seen so far, what is it looking like? Is this the response to the trauma of trafficking? Is this a result of being forced to be in a thinner body as someone being trafficked? I'm just curious if you can speak more to that.
It's very individualized. You know, there's a couple of situations that could happen in that, right? Traffickers will withhold food just as a means of control. Traffickers will also force them to engage in some type of drug consumption that, you know, keeps them asleep all day so that they can be awake all night. Because a lot of times trafficking does happen more so at night and the actual acts of it, the commercial sex act or even labor. And that can be one piece, right? We have to have nutrition all day. If we're sleeping all day, we're not getting it. And by the time we're up at, 7, 8 o'clock at night to start basically our day, that's one piece, right? So the body is adjusting to that type of nutrition intake, if any. And then yes, there is a component of, depending on the situation and potentially the region that someone is in or the client that they are servicing, that can play a role in maybe how someone is supposed to be portrayed or seen. Or there is a little bit of that control. So when someone is sitting that situation, That's hard, right? That's a long-term work. At this point, we're really working on, let's get you housing, let's get you safe. What can we do so that you don't go back into that situation? That's not to say that's negative, because there are people that come out of their situations and end up back in that. But let's get you to a point where if you do end up back in that, you know the resources and you know how to take care of yourself. But body image is a big piece of it. And then we think about the populations that are targeted in vulnerabilities when it comes to trafficking. When we think about gender, women and girls do face a higher risk for both trafficking as well as eating disorders, right? When we think about the data due to just the societal pressures. And then non-binary and transgender individuals, the marginalized and discrimination, there's another big vulnerability. There's a lot of these different vulnerabilities that can play a role in, one, we think about the development of eating disorders, also in intersex individuals who may be groomed for trafficking.
So we've outlined that there's so many challenges, right? There's not enough data, there's not enough resources, there's not enough attention and understanding. I'd love to hear any other challenges that you'd like to mention, and then also just some of the rewards of working with the population and doing some of the boots on the ground work that you do.
I would say the challenging is individuals, again, they're so traumatized and they don't even realize what their needs are at that point, because they're so used to someone else telling them what their needs are. And as therapists, that's not our role. As providers, our role is to be able to guide and provide ethically what we can to a certain extent. So when you have someone sitting across from you that's like, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. For the last 5-10 years, I've been told what to do. I've been told when to eat. I've been told how to look. It's just very much approaching it in a trauma-informed way. So I'd say that's the biggest barrier, is just really being able to meet someone where they're at. It can be hard to sit across from someone because you do want to help and you want to be like, no, there's like so much for you. You can do X, Y, and Z, but if they're not ready, that's not going to be helpful for them. They really need to be able to see that for themselves, that they've been in such a turmoil and controlling situation, and that control is showing up in all these other aspects of their life that they don't even realize that they are deserving and allowed to have control of. So I think that's the hardest part, is really just sitting across from people that are expecting you to have the answers. But the rewarding part of it as well is when they are able to see that they are allowed to have control, that they do have a say in what they eat and what they do, where they go, who they can talk to, engaging back with friends, going back to school, having families because they want, whatever it may be, and that they can do that. But it takes a long time, and someone might get to that point, and then it feels really scary. It's like, oh, I actually can't let go of that. I see what you're saying. I'm really trying to work for it, but no, I don't know if I can do that. That can be also really tough, is they're starting to believe in themselves. They're starting to take control where they should. And then it can be scary for them because they don't know what to do with control.
And that's so, to your comment earlier, analogous to what someone feels in their eating disorder too. It feels like the comfortable security blanket because it's familiar. And the unknown of what will life look like without this is far more terrifying than continuing to have this detrimental influence in their life. That makes so much sense. I'm really curious because as an outpatient provider, I can already hear there are clear deficits in my own assessment process. And I'm curious what you have learned and what you would recommend to providers out there of how to improve their own ability to screen or create safety for individuals to disclose they're experiencing trafficking.
Yeah, it is. Very, very much so. And there's definitely, again, maybe more vulnerable population, but it can present for anyone.
So it's important that we're all aware, ask questions, and assess and get resources to people that need it.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow,
Oh my
Kira,
goodness.
thank you. You are just a gem, and we are so grateful that you were willing to share your knowledge with us here at Berry and for the good that you're doing in the world. Thank you for your contribution.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was great talk. I love being able to talk about this, and like you said, I could talk about this for hours. So, thank you.
Well, maybe we'll have a round 2 one of these days. All right. Thanks, Kira. This was DocTalk. I'm Dr. Corinne Hannan.
I'm Dr. Erin Knopf.
I'd definitely say always wanting to come from that trauma-informed space, creating a safe place, building that trust and rapport. Most likely, if you're sitting across from a trafficking victim, unless they have identified that they are and that is what they're seeking treatment for, they are not going to willingly share that. You have to get to that, build that safety for them to want to share that and feel safe enough to share that. That's one of the first point of contact, is being trauma informed, ensuring the confidentiality, using strength-based approach, because so much of their controlled experience is not based off of strengths. They might be manipulated and told certain things are their strengths, and in actuality, it's been used against them. There is also the adult human trafficking screening tool and guide for public health and behavioral health and many other providers out there. That is a great tool that just asks about 8 different questions, identifying different areas to think about, whether that's history and background, social connections, physical well-being, psychological and emotional state. And there's certain ways to ask a question when we think about being trauma informed, right? When I'm working with anyone, is I'll ask, like, have you ever been denied access to medical care or medications? That's a really informative question, because if you're in a trafficking situation, most likely your trafficker will not take you if you need medical care. They won't take you to a doctor. They won't take you to see a professional. I think that's a question that can lead to a little bit more, it's just curiosity. Someone might say, yeah, I've been to the doctor. But if you say, have you ever been denied? That adds a whole nother element to it.
Great question.
I love how subtle it is to really better ascertain how much autonomy or agency did someone have in their life. And yes, it's different if you're working with a child and adolescent patient, but even then, it's probably still good to check in, make sure those parents are getting them the right care.
Yeah. When I was working in DC, I actually worked with adolescents in the court systems that had to go to court due to being in trafficking situations. And going back to the beginning of this talk, adolescents there doesn't have to be forced or coercion, and there can't be any legal implications. However, if they're involved in a trafficking situation where they had to engage in illicit drug use or engage in grooming of some kind, selling those things they can be charged with. And those are certain questions you can also ask when it comes to an adolescent that maybe they don't realize what they're doing it for. Have you ever been asked to sell anything? What does that look like? Have you ever engaged in drug use? Because those are things that somebody who is the trafficker would groom someone into that. Hey, if you do this for me, and then slowly building that network. That from the adolescent side, how to be curious, because you can ask an adolescent, have you ever been denied medical care? They may not know what that means. But if you ask them about their social, what does that look like when you're not in school, or if you're in school? Do you ever feel safe? When you're walking home from school, if you walk home from school, do you have to walk with someone? Do you get to just be by yourself on your way home? Little things like that can be indicators. When I worked with the court system, with individuals, most of these adolescents I worked with had families, and their parents had no idea until they got in trouble for some other, whether that was selling certain property or drug use. And slowly we learned they were in a trafficking situation.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like even the whole drug industry is probably guilty of this, because kids get coerced into, being part of that transition. And I will admit, okay, this is going off of some of my Netflix watching, so grain of salt. But again, lots of kids there helping with drug dealers. So, wow. I mean, this is so informative. I could honestly listen to you talk about this for a whole other hour, because I just feel like, yeah, we don't know what we don't know. And this is such a vulnerable population. We do all have a duty as members of the behavioral health world to be more prepared and be intentional. Because I definitely have never asked anyone those questions. There was only one time in my entire training experience, I was on an ER shift and had a teenage girl come in. She had escaped something and was really struggling, was worried about who was going to come find her at the hospital. At first, she got dismissed as having a psychotic break, but she was with it. It was not a psychotic situation at all. But I have never once thought of the more subtle nuances you've presented today. So thank you. I already feel like I can be a better provider from hearing you speak.
I think that's right. I don't expect every professional to be eating disorder informed, but just asking the right questions so that they can connect them with the appropriate resources for that. You don't have to be an expert in it. It's about, okay, let me ask these questions just to see if you need those resources.
You took the words out of my mouth. I was seeing the overlap with
Mhm.
people don't know how to screen for, assess for, and ask questions about eating disorders. It's sorely misunderstood. And this is another area that's deeply misunderstood. One other question I had about a parallel is that often people don't know that eating disorders really cut across all identities, all profiles, all body sizes, all socioeconomic statuses, all ethnicities, all races, everything. Is this pretty much true with trafficking?